Have you ever felt so passionately about something that you wanted to climb onto a rooftop and shout as loud as you possibly can? Well, maybe you haven't yet, but that was precisely how one of the most important revolutions in the Americas began. After adventuring across the Andes alongside our different liberators in South America, today we're heading north to trace the revolutionary roots of a country that, for many of us, might be like the neighbor we've heard a lot about, but have never actually sat down with and gotten to know. Yup, today we'll be discussing Mexico's epic story of how folks of different races and classes banded together to liberate one of the biggest countries not only in the Americas but across the world. So buckle in and get ready for another ride to revolution. Here are today's guiding questions. How might colonial history and the social structure of Nueva España have influenced early revolutionary ambitions? How did Miguel Hidalgo's own experiences and ideas influence the trajectory of the Mexican independence movement? And our big picture question for today, how do our identities and experiences influence our perspective of justice? When Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés and his army arrived in Mesoamerica in 1519, he encountered a bustling, complex collection of indigenous civilizations that had been developing across the continent for tens of thousands of years. Under the control of the Aztec Empire, the capital city of Tenochtitlan had become a flourishing hub of commerce, urban development, and religious significance. But by 1521, just 2 years later, what had once been the largest city across the pre-Columbian Americas had fallen. Although many Aztecs died at the hands of Spanish swords and muskets, most of the population was decimated by a combination of smallpox and other disease imported from Europe. In the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish constructed Mexico City, which would serve as a base for the expansion of their colonial empire and the capital of their viceroyalty of Nueva España, or New Spain, for the next 300 years. You might remember the Spanish initially divided its American colonies into two viceroyalties, with Peru covering its South American territories and Nueva España encompassing modern-day Mexico, Central America, archipelagos in the Pacific, and much of the southwestern United States. Although initially just soldiers and priests, Spanish immigration to Nueva España expanded over the years as commoners and aristocrats alike came to cash in on the vast amounts of silver, gold, and other natural resources that the empire was extracting all over the continent. Over time, the social structure became more stratified and rigid, eventually leading to a system that privileged Spanish-born peninsulares the most, followed by American-born Creoles, then mixed-race mestizos, and finally, indigenous peoples. Not surprisingly, many mestizos and indigenous people harbored deep resentment toward peninsulares for stealing their ancestral lands, as well as the racist policies that legalized that plunder and other injustices. This resentment bled across generations, manifesting itself in events like the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, when Pueblo natives drove Spanish forces out of New Mexico after the Spanish governor ordered the execution of several Pueblo holy men. Even Creoles were touched by class anger, harboring a strong animosity towards peninsulares and the legal privileges they enjoyed. With all the resentment building, it was enough to make someone want to scream out at the top of their lungs. And scream he did. But first, a quick moment to reflect. How might colonial history and the social structure of Nueva España have influenced early revolutionary ambitions? Let's start with the man behind the shout. Born into a Creole family in Nueva Galicia, Nueva España, in 1753, Miguel Hidalgo was encouraged by his father, a well-to-do hacienda manager, to enter the priesthood. There, he studied Latin, rhetoric, logic, indigenous languages, and even French, which allowed him to engage with many key Enlightenment ideas. Although the Catholic Church wasn't the biggest fan of the Enlightenment at the time, These Enlightenment ideas, however, stayed with Hidalgo even after he graduated. As a priest and college professor, he began to challenge the political and religious institutions of the time. He questioned things like the absolute authority of the Spanish king, the power of the pope, and even the restriction on clergy members getting married. All of these questions, as well as maybe his love of gambling or his having 8 children with 4 different women, eventually got Hidalgo hauled before the Inquisition, although he was eventually acquitted. He also challenged church norms by not invoking a vow of poverty, opting instead to pursue his own business interests. However, when he was 50 years old, he was sent to the small town of Dolores in modern-day Guanajuato. It was here as the parish priest that his questioning evolved into revolutionary ambition, and by the middle of 1810, Hidalgo found himself enveloped in pro-independence discussions throughout the region. Fearing his imminent arrest, he assembled a large crowd of peasants in Dolores on the morning of September 16th. It was there that he rang the church bell and gave a rousing call demanding independence from Spain. This would later be known as El Grito de Dolores, or the Cry of Dolores. Aside from essentially declaring war on the colonial government, Hidalgo's cry also called for redistribution of land and racial equality, which left some conservative Creoles hesitant to support the cause. After the immediate arrests of all the peninsulares in Dolores, Hidalgo led an army of almost 80,000 mestizo and indigenous followers to Mexico City. Inspired but untrained, the crowd grew as it moved from town to town, leaving a bloodbath in its wake in some cities, which Hidalgo later regretted. The Spanish and Creole class were alarmed by the sudden threat to their legal protections and property. But due to tactical errors, Hidalgo and his followers were not able to take the city and were eventually defeated by Spanish troops in 1812. Although Hidalgo was arrested and eventually executed, he is still considered the father of Mexican independence, as other leaders rose up to continue the fight until Mexico could finally call itself free. How did Miguel Hidalgo's own experiences and ideas influence the trajectory of the Mexican independence movement? Did you know today Mexico celebrates its Independence Day on September 16th, not Cinco de Mayo like some folks believe? Cinco de Mayo actually commemorates the day Mexican forces defeated French troops in the Battle of Puebla 50 years later and isn't widely celebrated in Mexico. After the death of Hidalgo, other leaders like José María Morelos, Mariano Matamoros, and Vicente Guerrero rose up from all over Nueva España with similar demands for the redistribution of land, racial justice, and independence. What made some of these leaders distinct was that many were mestizos, which meant they experienced the racial injustices of the times differently than Hidalgo, who came from a Creole family. Morelos and Guerrero would eventually become two of the most prominent voices of the revolution, with Morelos calling for the abolition of slavery and racial classes. However, in 1815, Morelos was ultimately captured and executed. Ironically, his captor would go on to become one of the future leaders of the independence movement. In 1820, the conservative Creole general, Agustín de Iturbide, feared that Spain's recent liberal constitution would mean a loss of his and other Creoles' privileges and wealth in Nueva España. So he changed sides, meeting with Vicente Guerrero, who he had fought against previously, to try and build a coalition of mestizo, indigenous, and former royalist soldiers to march on Mexico City. In 1821, the new coalition entered the city, and Iturbide was declared emperor of the newly formed Mexican Empire. His governing document, the Plan de Iguala, although not as radical as that of Morelos, guaranteed Mexico would be an independent nation, Catholicism would be the official religion, and that all inhabitants would be considered equals. Iturbide's reign as emperor, however, was short-lived. He was exiled to Europe in 1823 and was ultimately executed when he returned to Mexico soon after. Before we move on, let's reflect for a moment. How do you think Agustín de Iturbide's background influenced his rise to power? 1823 was also the year that Central America declared its absolute independence from Mexico, calling itself the United Provinces of Central America, which included modern-day Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Costa Rica. Although not the first or last to achieve independence from the Spanish Empire, Mexico and its story of liberation are important reminders of how someone's lived experiences can shape their ideas of liberty and freedom. Next time, we're headed back down to South America for one more revolution, although you might want to practice your Portuguese first. Till then, stay curious and remember, history is everywhere.
Hey, hey.